Dictators fear freedom of speech more than any other right because it's the beating heart of a free and democratic society. People who are free to speak are free to challenge authority. They're free to share ideas and organize, all of which undermine tyranny. This is why a true measure of a nation's freedom can be seen in how much dissent it is willing to tolerate. And in a vibrant democracy, dissent is valued, not simply tolerated. In the 1700s, the American framers, having recently freed themselves from British rule that suppressed free speech and persecuted dissent, understood the crucial role that the First Amendment would play in protecting citizens from government overreach. Benjamin Franklin observed, quote, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech, a thing terrible to public traitors." It's no wonder, then, that the Trump administration has set its sights on America's universities, institutions that serve as major centers of deliberation and free inquiry, institutions that have historically been principal sites and incubators of dissent and protest. If speech can be effectively chilled in these critical intellectual spaces, it makes it much easier to silence the broader public. In recent weeks, the Trump administration has threatened universities with massive cuts to federal funding if they don't submit to his agenda, which includes dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and banning what Trump is calling illegal protests. On March 10th, the administration notified 60 universities that they are under investigation for what it alleges is a failure to protect students from anti-Semitism on campus, and that the schools face potential enforcement actions as a result. Now, this comes at a time when there's an active debate on college campuses about what constitutes anti-Semitism and whether protest against Israel's actions in Gaza should be included in that definition. The Trump administration also announced that it was investigating 52 schools for what it calls racial preferences and stereotypes in their educational programs and activities. That's essentially a continuation of its attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And just this week, the White House announced that it's pausing $175 million in federal funding to the University of Pennsylvania over its transgender athlete policies. And in a move that stunned the academic community nationwide, the Trump administration attempted to exert unprecedented control over Columbia University by threatening to cut $400 million in federal funding unless Columbia met a long list of demands, among them placing the school's Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies Department under academic receivership for at least 5 years. Despite widespread calls from across the academic world urging Columbia to defend its independence, it appears that as of last night, Columbia's interim president, Katrina Armstrong, has conceded to Donald Trump's demands. Armstrong announced several new measures, including a ban on masks to conceal identities, the hiring of 36 campus officers with the authority to arrest students, and the appointment of a new senior vice provost to review programs in regional areas across the university, starting immediately with the Middle East, end quote. Meanwhile, running parallel to these investigations and threats, the Trump administration has been deploying ICE agents to campuses to seize international students who have no criminal record, are accused of no crimes, but who have participated in protests or online criticism of Israel's conduct in Gaza, university investments in Israel, America's military support of Israel, or the continuing war itself. Trump's assault on academia has prompted massive opposition, with growing calls for administrators to resist this assault on academic independence. J Street, a Jewish lobbyist group, issued a statement saying, quote, "While Trump will stop at nothing to attack higher education, we remain firm in our belief that universities are a tool for empathy, understanding, and academic freedom. If the administration was serious about fighting anti-Semitism, it might start by throwing out the slew of bigots and conspiracy theorists it has promoted to top positions in its own ranks," end quote. University presidents, from Wesleyan's Michael Roth to Princeton's Christopher Eisgruber, have joined in condemning the administration's assault on higher education. In The Atlantic, Princeton President Eisgruber wrote, quote, "The attack on Columbia is a radical threat to scholarly excellence and to America's leadership in research. Universities and their leaders should speak up and litigate forcefully to protect their rights," end quote. Trump's efforts to seize control of academia are part of a broader campaign to neutralize institutions that could potentially threaten his power. From law firms and media outlets to government inspectors general and federal judges, the administration is targeting every major institution that could challenge its agenda. But Trump's threats to cut off funding to some of the world's premier research universities and deport students is especially alarming because the consequences of this intellectual retreat are not theoretical. During the Red Scare of the early 1950s, the U.S. government expelled hundreds of immigrants, including Chinese students, effectively gifting the Chinese government with trained U.S. scientists and engineers. One of those scientists was Chien Shuai-sung. Today, he's known as the father of China's ballistic missile program. Writing for the publication Just Security, Nicholas Sung observes, quote, "The very Chinese missiles that threaten Taiwanese and American security are the legacy of the United States government's profiling and deportation of a Chinese scientist." Former U.S. Navy Secretary Dan Kimball, who fought to keep Cheyenne in this country, was less polite in his criticism of the calls for Cheyenne's deportation, saying it was, quote, "the stupidest thing this country ever did. He was no more a communist than I was, and we forced him to go." Cheyenne wasn't the only victim of the Red Scare. Among its earliest victims was, in fact, the federal workforce, and it would eventually sweep up thousands of innocent Americans, destroying careers and reputations. According to the historian Beverly Gage, quote, "the anti-communist surge reshaped every institution in American life: Hollywood, labor unions, churches, universities, elementary schools, and above all, the national security state. From on high, they told ordinary Americans how to live, whom to love, and what to say." Today, a similar pattern is emerging, and make no mistake, MAGA hysteria won't only be confined to America's campuses. Karen Attiah, a columnist for the Washington Post, warns, quote, "For now, the threat is directed at others: Palestinians, undocumented immigrants, trans people. For this kind of strategy to work, there must be an intentional creation of distance between human beings, the illusion that they are different from us and that the weapons we throw at them are from a comfortable distance. This distance is and has always been a delusion. Unless a groundswell of popular resistance moves to meaningfully stop the Trump administration's targeting of Columbia and students, the rest of America will be considered prey. It is a matter of when, not if." Joining me now is Karen Attiah, columnist for the Washington Post and author of The Golden Hour on Substack, and Jason Stanley, a professor of philosophy at Yale University and author of the book Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Karen, good to see you. You're a Columbia alum. You wrote emphatically about this danger, and you make the point. I mean, there are two separate points here. One is that universities shouldn't cave to governments or censorship, number one. Number two is that if you allow this to happen, it's not just the universities in danger, it's everybody.
Absolutely. I mean, I think history has shown that. I think that, we're already seeing that in terms of research grants that trickle all the way down to hospitals, to other research facilities, into science, into, genetic diversity of seeds and plants that are being challenged by this new administration because they cannot stand the idea that anyone who doesn't look like them, who doesn't think like them, who represents a threat to a certain social order deserves to be taken out. And it breaks my heart as an alum, as a former lecturer, and I think you were spot on in your previous monologue when the entire world is watching how these universities are handling this. I have so many friends, so many people who say, if Columbia isn't safe, it stands for something else, that America itself is not safe. And to think that it's only going to stop at students, at Palestinians, at Black people, at trans people is a delusion. And I wish people would wake up, and I wish people would see that this is not just being anti-DEI. If it wasn't anti-DEI, if it wasn't anti-Semitism, there would be some other excuse, some other cover. Yeah. What this is about a purging, and is about exclusion, and is about, frankly, segregation.
And that's why it was important Jason, to talk about McCarthyism and communism, because it can always be something. It's the point that either universities stand strong or they don't.
That's right. People forget that history is watching. all the enablers of this fascist takeover, from the president and board of Columbia University to the op-ed writers of the New York Times, whose job seems to be to normalize a fascist takeover, all of these people will go down in the history books as cowards, villains, or fools. Universities need to step up. They need to band together at this moment. This talk of ducking as so you won't be a target, that presupposes that they're targeting other universities. That is nonsensical talk. It needs to go away. The universities need to band together to protect democracy. They're fundamental democratic institutions. The richer institutions, like my own at Yale, need to support financially the poorer institutions in this moment of extreme emergency.
Karen, obviously, we're talking about a lot of money. At Penn, it's $175 million. At Columbia, it was $400 million. At Johns Hopkins, it's even more because of the medical research they do. But in a lot of places, they're targeting programs. At Penn, it's transgender stuff. At Columbia, it seems to be these protests. But once you start targeting anything, you lose. I mean, is the government going to take over medical research at Johns Hopkins?
The idea that Columbia, specifically, the home of the famous Palestinian scholar Edward Said, has now agreed to place Middle Eastern studies, African studies, other studies under a special provost, it reeks of the very oppression that we have committed abroad. Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, this prioritizing money over values, prioritizing money over students' safety, over faculty safety, over Jewish safety, over Black safety, just means the facade has crumbled. And maybe it was always going to crumble at some point. But the truth is people's lives are being destroyed and livelihoods are being destroyed over this.
Jason, let's talk about that. I spoke to the president of Wesleyan University the other day, by the way, who's a supporter of Israel. It's not a supporter of the current Israeli government, but that's not unusual. His point, J Street's point, there are a whole bunch of people who say, you want to fight anti-Semitism? That's a laudable goal, and it is a goal we should all be involved in. And in fact, the government should have a role in that as well. But using it as cover, particularly for this kid at Columbia, who was not what they say he was and has been charged with no crime, or the Georgetown professor who maybe should get an award for how much work they've done between people with cultural differences. It's the wrong approach.
It's wrong approach. I mean, as historian Timothy Snyder recently pointed out, history does not have an example of universities and free speech being targeted to benefit Jewish people. The university in American life is, among other things, a very Jewish institution. When you're attacking universities supposedly to protect Jewish people, it is obviously hypocritical. And this places American Jews at the center of American politics. This is never good for the Jews, as we say. American Jews will go down in history books if this continues, if we enable this, as the people responsible for taking down the greatest system of higher education in human history. We are being set up here. We are being set up by the Trump regime, and we need to resist this and speak out loudly against this for the preservation of our people in the United States.
Karen, Columbia didn't, or at least it seems like they're not going to for the moment. Are you seeing hope, though? Are you seeing others? Because I mean, faculty, students, there are a lot of people saying this is not the way to solve any of our problems. Universities are not only supposed to be about freedom of expression, but it's one of the best places where dissent can exist.
Yeah, I've been seeing students, alums banding together. I've been seeing people, going to protests, wanting to sign letters, trying to figure out how to save each other. I mean, so many people I know are deathly afraid, are afraid of ICE, citizens even, who are scrubbing their phones, who are thinking to not travel because they're not sure if they can come back. I've never seen this level of an atomic level anxiety and fear. And this is not something that just goes away. Yeah. And so I think what I've been seeing is people trying to help each other with how to deal with a violent regime that we have here, how to survive this, how to not get detained, digital security. So far, I suppose that's the help I've been seeing with each other and speaking out. And, honestly, Colombia showing its cowardice means that it's the people, it's like Jason, it's like you, those of us who are speaking out. We are the leaders. The universities are now in the streets in a way, and on the op-ed pages, doing what we can. And that's all we can do. But again, I do believe that right now, again, the future of America's systems, democracy, people's lives are at stake. This is not just a theoretical thing. People's families are being ripped apart. All of it could be gone in an instant. And I hope that people understand everything can be okay until it's not.
It's on all of us to stand up for these important rights. Karen, thanks very much for being with us. Karen Attiah is a columnist for the Washington Post. Jason Stanley is a professor of philosophy at Yale University.